Okay, so we're beginning. So thank you for joining us today. All of you, I'm sure many people are joining from Japan and outside. Thank you for joining us. Before we move on to the main part of our webinar today, I'd like to introduce a little bit about our organization and a little bit about this webinar series. So this event, webinar series is hosted by Align, but this particular episode is co-hosted by AI Alignment Talk from Japan. AI Alignment Network, Align, is a nonprofit organization based in Japan, which is creating ecosystem of researchers and practitioners in the field of AI safety, AI alignment. And AI alignment here includes not only technical research, but also on single AI model, the broader topics regarding interaction between human and AI. AI Alignment Talk from Japan is the student-led organization group aimed at raising awareness about AI alignment and among young researchers, and especially university students here in Japan. So this is the second episode of this webinar series, and we just had one yesterday too. But today we are inviting Tan Zhi Xuan, a PhD candidate in MIT Probabilistic Computing Project and Computational Cognitive Science Labs. Xuan's research centers around Bayesian modeling, AI alignment, and cognitive science. And their research aims to investigate a range of questions, including how to model human reasoning, decision-making, and value formation in a structured and detailed manner, as well as how to use Bayesian inference to learn human goals, values, and cooperative norms from these models, and how to develop AI systems that reliably adhere to these inferred goals and norms. So today we will hear from Xuan about important questions that lie in the intersection of AI alignment, philosophical pluralism, collective governance. And we will learn from them current state and challenges, as well as potential approaches to align AI with our collective interests. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Xuan. So please welcome Xuan, and I will give the sharing screen to Xuan.
Yeah, thanks so much, Marie, for the introduction. Very happy to be here. I just want to say before we start, it's like nice to see, to meet all of you at AI Alignment Japan, and good to see more about AI alignment community just growing in Asia in general. I'm originally from Singapore, so I know for quite a while, a lot of the activity has been centered in America and Europe, and it's kind of nice to see other centers developing. Let me share my screen, and then we can get started. So can everyone see that? Right, and I'll just preface this by saying this is a sort of updated version of the talk I gave initially 2 years ago for the EAGX Singapore conference titled "What Should AI Owe to Us?" It's an effort to condense a lot of my thinking about AI alignment over the past few years, and I think why we need to reorient the field towards a different set of questions and directions that have been pursued so far. And since the time I gave this talk, I think there's been more research in the kind of directions I've been talking about here, but I think there's still a lot for us to be doing, and sort of by sort of thinking about alignment from a sort of more pluralistic and sort of more sort of how would you say it, contractualist perspective is the sort of term I would like to use, and I'm going to introduce some of those ideas throughout the course of this talk. Right, so because this is going to be a fairly involved talk, I'm going to just give a brief overview first of what the ground I'm going to cover. I'll first introduce the dominant conceptual framework in most technical AI alignment research nowadays, which I think can be approximately described as preference utilitarian or preferentist in its approach. And I'll then discuss why this framework faces numerous practical and political challenges if we actually want to extend it to multiple humans, values, and AI systems, and why we need to deal with this kind of multiplicity. And given the situation, I outlined some considerations and desiderata that a successful approach to societal scale AI alignment should address, right? And finally, I'll develop a pluralist, contractualist AI alignment framework as an alternative framework for addressing these considerations, including implications for AI governance, technical alignment research, and their philosophical foundation. So point 4 there is actually going to be the bulk of the talk in a way. Cool. But before we start, just as a brief primer, what is AI alignment? I'm sure all of you here know that already, otherwise you wouldn't be part of this group. But just to sort of like set terms and define them a bit more clearly and to sort of talk about the focus of this talk, and because I think there's closely related term called AI safety. And I think it's important for us to always be clear, like, what is the goal here and how do they relate to each other, right? And so while everyone kind of has their own definitions for these terms these days, I'm going to be working with these ones. AI alignment is the project of building intelligent systems that robustly act in our collective interests, whereas AI safety is a project of ensuring that such systems avoid potentially catastrophic harm, right? And it's important to note that these are different projects. There are ways to keep AI systems safe that do not require us to ensure that it really fully understands human values or necessarily promotes human flourishing, and sort of like a weaker requirement than what I think of AI alignments trying to achieve. And in fact, these days, I actually think there needs to be more work on AI safety that's separate from the broader goal of AI alignment, in part because I think a lot of the research that gets called alignment these days isn't necessarily going to give us strong safety guarantees. And so if you're interested in more in the AI safety side of things, there's actually recently this paper as I've contributed a bit to on trying to achieve guaranteed safe AI that people might be interested in taking a look at and seeing how that sort of is a bit of a different approach than, say, learning human values. Still, I think this is primarily going to be a talk about AI alignment, right? Because I still think it's worth thinking about clearly about what a positive vision of AI might look like, right? So even if we make it safe, what do we want AI to do for us? Or what do you think it should owe to us? Sort of harking to the title of the talk, right? And I think that includes thinking about an AI safety. That's certainly one thing we want out of aligned AI. But I think we want to think sort of more beyond that. Like, what does it mean to sort of act robustly in our interests? What does collective interest mean? And how does thinking about that in terms of something other than preferences is better sort of enliven our understanding of what we're trying to do, right? Cool. So let's take a look at what exactly this dominant approach that people have been pursuing mostly so far is, right? I'm going to call this a preference utilitarian approach to AI alignment. And Stuart Russell's principles for beneficial AI are actually a pretty good summary of the high-level ideas behind this approach, right? So recognizing that many dangers arise when machines optimize for proxy metrics that differ from what we truly care about, Stuart Russell actually advocates instead that machines should try to directly realize human preferences, and that machines should initially be uncertain about what these preferences are, and that these preferences should be learned from human behavior, right? So sort of maybe like Baymax from Big Hero 6, a machine that's like friendly and beneficial and that it only wants to try and help, right? And more broadly, researchers have come to frame the problem of alignment as one of that might be called something like utility matching, right? Under certain assumptions, a single human's preferences can be represented as a utility function over outcomes. And so taking this assumption, alignment researchers' goals have been to build AI systems that optimize the same utility function, right? And like that's how the problem is framed. And the question is, why is that hard? It's because it's possible to ensure that the system does the right thing during development or training time. It's much harder to ensure this during deployment, especially as systems become more capable of achieving new kinds of outcomes we didn't initially anticipate. So for example, a self-driving car might safely avoid obstacles for all situations it was trained on, but at deployment, the objective is effectively maximizing for might be much more positive than the true human objective, right? So it ends up optimizing for wrong things, leading to things like car crashes. It's sort of a fairly grounded example. So the goal of a lot of alignment research today is to avoid this problem, to ensure the AI systems optimize for the right utility function, even as they grow more powerful and encounter radically new scenarios that the human designers didn't think of. And I want to sort of point out one thing is sort of like these days it actually isn't even clear to me this is the right way to frame the problem, because it sort of assumes that AI systems are going to be like very strong utility maximizers, right? So this is the kind of traditional frame that people have been working in. But especially with the advent of large language models, I think there have been more debates about, is it really right to think, they're really powerful, but it's not necessarily the case that they're powerful in the sense they're really strongly optimizing utility function. And so I think even though there are still these worries, and I think it's still important to figure out cases when we do have strong utility maximizers, what do we do about their safety, or what do we do about their alignment? I think it's worth thinking more about whether this is the right frame in the first place, right? I'm separately going to argue that, even for sort of strong utility maximization, if we're assuming all AI systems are strong utility maximizers, I think this way of thinking about a problem is still really not enough. And one reason why is, even if we achieve this kind of alignment to a single human or a single objective function, unilateral alignment of the sort could well be disastrous, right? It's not enough for a powerful optimizing system to be aligned with a single objective or metric, because other objectives matter. It's a sort of simple point. For example, you can imagine an AI-managed decentralized crypto company that's perfectly aligned to the objective of maximizing profits, but without any grounding of the value of profit to real commodities or human welfare. And so eventually it commissions enough crypto mining server farms to cause irreversible catastrophic climate change by 2050 without people realizing until it's too late. Right? That's one way the world could sort of end slowly. Similarly, it's not enough for a powerful optimizing system to be aligned with a single institution or individual or organization, because other individuals matter, right? And for example, you can imagine a tech company or authoritarian leader effectively sort of taking over the world through powerful aligned AI systems, which are aligned to only their interests, and potentially keeping only humans alive, but in, say, severe oppression, right? So just to put this again in graphical terms, a simplified version of the situation we're in is one where we have multiple objectives or humans, each with their own utility functions, if you want to describe them that way. And we want to somehow align an AI system to all of them. And if we just align the AI system to one human, as shown here, the optimal outcome for that human could actually be quite disastrous for another, or perhaps many other people, right? So what should we do instead, right? And so faced with this problem, I think a sort of like traditional naive approach to this is like, well, maybe we can just build a single powerful AI system that aggregates preferences across all humans, optimizing for the sum or mean of their utility functions. Effectively would build a preference utilitarian AI system, the agent that acts to satisfy the most preferences for the most people. And there's actually economic theory that provides some theoretical justification for thinking that something like this is good, like Harsanyi's aggregation theorem by the economist John Harsanyi, and provided we make some perhaps potentially quite strong assumptions about what human preferences are like. So why not do something like this, right? Now, separate of, I think, the sort of philosophical challenges to utilitarianism, I think they're just like a bunch of practical reasons we wouldn't want to do something like this, right? And that's actually what I'm going to focus on, is that, this scheme for aligning a single system to multiple humans is computationally intractable, right? If we're really going to build something like a centralized AGI style agent, it tries to both learn and satisfies everyone's preferences. That's kind of a doubly intractable problem, because learning preferences is hard, and then planning to satisfy them, especially planning to satisfy them something like optimally, is a really hard problem, right? And this is actually very similar to the classic critique of central economic planning from the 20th century's socialist calculation debate, and it's sort of recapitulated, reiterated in this literature on the computational complexity of sort of parts of reinforcement learning, right? Secondly, I think even setting aside intractability, I think it will lead to the centralization of immense power if we actually try to do this, right? And we should really be worried about how this goes about, right? It really creates a single point of failure if this one powerful system is misaligned, and it really increases the risk of various forms of tyranny by a sort of single creator, right? And finally, the idea that we're going to build this single partial AI systems that's aligned to everyone's values, I think is just politically naive, right? Because it's incentive incompatible with our existing, I think, capitalist mode of development. I think, and more broadly, it's in tension with the basic fact, separate of strategic interests, that most people in communities want to do different things with different AI systems, right? Rather than make appeals to some kind of centralized AGI godlike system, right? And after all, that's how the AI economy today functions, right? AI systems serve in multiple uses and roles. For individuals, they're virtual assistants or household robots. For businesses and cooperatives, that's market forecasting or R&D automation. For communities, governments, and states, there's AI for energy distribution and traffic control. And I take it that it's by and large desirable that AI can serve these multiple different interests given our very diverse and plural sort of desires and values. And even if some of these ends are not directly desirable, perhaps AI surveillance and policing is something we ultimately don't want to have, I think we should nonetheless expect there to be a plurality amongst different people, what they want to use AI for, right? So as Eric Drexler notes in this sort of paper, which I think really influenced my thinking back in the day, reframing superintelligence, the AI economy today is really a service economy. And it seems like despite the development of these large models, the way we're getting improvement is not really through a single system improving itself, but through recursive improvement at the ecosystem level, with better AI tooling leading to better AI and so on, in such a way that might even remove the incentive to build general purpose single agents as traditionally conceived. That was sort of like, it used to be that people thought of AI a lot this way. A lot of people still do. And I think maybe we shouldn't. Relatedly, Andrew Critch and David Kruger says that, even if we have this idea of like, oh, there's going to be a single super powerful AI system, we should think that there's a reason to think that, first, there are going to be multiple stakeholders involved quite quickly, even within a single company and multiple companies. And also, like, it's going to be quite likely that the system itself is going to be replicated or copied elsewhere. And so we're already very quickly in this sort of situation where there's like multiple stakeholders and multiple systems that we all need to somehow align. Cool. So all of this motivates thinking about what alignment even means, if that's the right word, at a societal scale, right? And given everything I've discussed, I like to suggest at least two desiderata for any such approach, right? So first, I think we want plurality, right? AI systems, including advanced ones, can be used in a variety of roles to fulfill a variety of individual, communal, and universal interests. But second, we also want safety, right? Use of these AI systems or interactions between them shouldn't catastrophically endanger the interests of others or their ability to pursue their interests. Right? I think this is one vision of what it means to say societal scale alignment. So this relates to other considerations that people have raised, such as, again, Critch and Kruger's argument that both existential safety and societal stability motivate multi preparedness, as well as Ehson Gabriel's observation that we cannot expect moral agreement on what values to align AI with. And so we must instead ask, is there a fair way to decide how to align AI? So those are, I think, sort of kind of corners of the space where people have sort of made similar arguments to the argument I'm making today. All right, so that's the sort of the problem space. Those are our goals, right? What might be a solution to achieving those sort of plurality and safety? Well, here's my proposal. I'm going to call it contractualist AI alignment. And it's a framework inspired by pluralist and contractualist philosophical traditions. These traditions serve as the normative foundations of the framework I'm going to describe today, reframing the concept of even rationality itself in AI to account for a plurality of value-specific norms, and to understand moral and normative reasoning as a process of mutual justification, as about what we owe to each other, right? And these foundations inform the collective governance of AI systems, right? The process by which we decide the roles we would like AI systems to play in society, and the norms and the laws and system requirements they should adhere to given these roles, right? In other words, figuring out what AI should owe to us, right? And then with these norms and roles at hand, we can re-envision what the work of technical AI alignment is about. And it's not about satisfying human preferences, but about ensuring that AI systems comply with those norms potentially under ambiguity. Because while there are many norms and system requirements that we might be able to specify and formally model quite precisely, I think in many cases, laws and norms are also going to be ambiguous and incomplete, right? And so in cases where AI systems are really autonomous, they're not sort of just operating on your computer and doing one single task. I think they will increasingly have to handle cases where they sort of reverse engineer the content and purpose of the norms that we've described to them, partially and incompletely. So that's the overall framework. I want to sort of like make an analogy to sort of a very different philosophical tradition quite briefly, right? Even though I'm drawing upon this sort of fairly Western philosophical tradition of contractualism, I think there are sort of similarities with some certain like Confucian ideals here. Here I'm sort of drawing upon this famous line in the Analects by Confucius, where Lord Tsing of Qi asks Confucius about good governance, and he replies with this sort of cryptic phrase almost, 君君臣臣父父子子, that's how you pronounce it in Mandarin. And the Lord acts as a Lord, the minister as a minister, the father as a father, and the son as a son, right? So what does that mean? It just means that these individuals, how they should act is to play their proper roles. And if they didn't, society would collapse, right? And we could say the same about AI systems, right? Whether they're acting primarily to serve private interests or communal interests or public interests, they should be aligned with the norms governing those roles, right, for the whole system to work. Otherwise, and of course, we probably don't want a specific, very patriarchal and hierarchical roles that characterize Imperial China during the time of when Confucius lived. We'd like to define them perhaps more democratically for ourselves, but I think this frame of thinking about what it means to sort of like act and sort of act virtuously or like humanely is sort of helpful. So that's the big picture. Let's take it step by step and unpack what I mean by these pluralist, contractualist foundations, right? And by pluralism, I mean the kind of pluralism but value defended by the philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, amongst others, right? Rather than defining value as the goodness or badness of consequences, she asks us to remember the huge variety of ways that we value things in daily life, valuing someone as a friend, or loving one's child, or appreciating art. These evaluative attitudes guide our actions and thoughts about how to express those values, right? If we care for someone, we might, you think if you care for someone, you ought to help them. Otherwise, you're not really caring for them, right? We find something unfunny, we probably shouldn't laugh. And these values aren't just rewards or utilities to be traded off against each other, right? Rather, they're, I think, really the inputs to mental processes, right? The output preferences, right? They're part of like the semantics of the meaning of what it means, like what these words even mean, right? So, and so like what we do is we have these values and we sort of weigh them against each other, right? So let's say I have some like very normal practical dilemma, like my friend invites me to a concert, I care about them, so maybe want to visit, but I'm really tired from work, right? So do I stay at home because I value my rest instead, right? These values include interpersonal attitudes like love and respect, which brings us to intersubjective metaethics, right? Rather than framing ethics as maximizing the good, sort of non-utilitarian philosophers like Darwin and Scanlon instead frame it as what we owe to each other. And for them, this derives from the attitude of what it means to mutually respect each other as sort of, agents in the first place, right? Which means treating ourselves as potentially accountable to the claims and demands that others make upon us, which Darwin calls second personal reasons. And this serves as a basis for contractualist ethics and politics associated with philosophers like Scanlon and Rawls. To adjudicate between competing interpersonal claims, we engage in processes of impartial reasoning given our roles, relationships, and ends, right? For example, living by principles that serve our shared goals and ideals, are mutually agreeable, or that no one can reasonably reject, right? This gives us a framework for reasoning about the rules that we should follow. And so now, whether or not you find this personally compelling, perhaps you're a hardcore utilitarian, you don't like this stuff, I hope you can at least see sort of how this is relevant to the question of value alignment. I think a lot of the sort of way that alignment literature, especially the technical literature, has been framed, has inherited from the literature, the tradition of economics, decision theory, and rational choice theory in a way that I think has severely limited how we even think about what human values are. And I think if we really want to sort of do this broader project of aligning AI with human values and norms, it helps to have a good theory about what values and norms are that sort of encompasses the richness of what it seems like when you reflect on everyday evaluative decision-making. Right. Cool. So one especially appealing feature, I think, about this framing that I think is missing from, say, traditional expected utility theory is that it doesn't treat values and norms as fixed, but instead subject to reasoning, right? This departs from contemporary machine learning and reinforcement learning, which flattens all complexity of human values into objectives or rewards, right? Which someone, the designer comes up with it, and then it's just sort of never questioned, right? And instead, I think we want to expand our concept of rationality to include reasoning about norms and values. And just to give some examples, for example, it seems like we can reason about epistemic norms, right? Should I try to be Bayesian in how I update my beliefs, right? And there are sort of various arguments one can make for and against, yes, because otherwise people can cheat you of resources of money, or no, because due to unknown unknowns, Bayesianism just doesn't account for that kind of epistemic state. We can also reason about what to value, say, should I care about the welfare of non-human animals? There are many critiques, for or perhaps against, right? Argument for sentience is one way of because many animals feel and suffer like humans do, they ought to have moral standing, or perhaps they have some cognitive capacities for personhood, they ought to have moral standing. There are different arguments for caring. Finally, we can reason about principles that govern our collective lives. So, for example, should mask wearing be mandated during a pandemic? We can appeal to meta principles and trying to come up with an answer to questions like these, right? For example, we can apply to something like rule utilitarianism, which says that, well, if everyone did that, we would all be better off. We could sort of apply veil of ignorance reasoning, because any one of us could have been born in a very vulnerable sort of body. Or we could sort of apply this idea of reasonable rejection from Stephen Darwell, right? That a high risk person could, in the context of a pandemic, could reasonably reject the alternative of no one masking at all, because that would potentially pose a sort of unacceptably high risk to their sort of health. Great. And this isn't just something that philosophers do, by the way, in their armchairs. One of my colleagues, Sidney Levine, has actually shown that a certain form of Kantian moral reasoning called universalization actually predicts lay people's moral judgments, or at least some lay people's moral judgments, right? Using a mathematical model that embeds such reasoning. Just to explain this in more detail, what Sidney found is that if you ask people to judge how much fish it's okay to catch from a shared lake, then at least some people will reason this way. If everyone fishes from a lake, is that good for everyone, or is that bad for everyone? If it's good, then it's fine, right? But if it's bad because it leads to overfishing and depletion of the fish population, then I shouldn't do it, even though unilaterally I would benefit from it, right? So perhaps then we could imbue AI systems with these kinds of abilities to reason about values and norms that some humans definitely are engaging in, instead of learning existing human preferences, which may be flawed in important ways. In fact, in trying to build these kinds of reasoning systems, we can actually draw upon a long tradition of more classical AI research that has sought to define and implement how people argue and reason about more complicated things than just what traditional first-order logic has done for us, right? And these kinds of argumentation-based reasoning systems, it's actually possible to define a set of potentially mutually incompatible arguments and figure out what set of arguments is the most coherent and also defends itself against counter-arguments, right? Unlike currently popular machine learning methods, like just trying to prompt a large language model to try and do moral reasoning for us, this actually gives us a clear definition of what it means to do sound reasoning, even in aspects of life where there may not be a single correct answer. And in contrast to traditional logic-based AI, this allows us, I think, to sort of more naturally handle a lot of the contradictory intuitions that come up in reasoning about our moral values, or even just our practical values, like the sort of practical dilemma I mentioned earlier of I have to decide between sort of going to see my friend's concert or getting more rest, right? It's not obvious that you can just think about what would I truly, it's like, what are my true desires here? We're not really doing that and trying to come up with an answer. Great. So there's a lot more I could say about these normative foundations and philosophical foundations and how we could possibly start implementing them in machines. But in the interest of time, let's move on to the second pillar of this framework, which is collective governance, right? So taking a sort of philosophy as a starting point, how can we go about governing things? And I think the project there is really not just one of enforcing rules and norms, but designing them, right? Taking a leaf from value-sensitive design, mechanism design, and political constructivism, we should first ask, what social and institutional roles do we want AI systems to play in our lives? And then, given those roles, collectively decide sort of what norms, objectives, or law should guide and regulate that behavior. Right? And this is, of course, actually achieving this is a sort of ideal that's very far from achievable in real life, but I think it's still useful as a guide and provides a sort of constructive approach to AI policy, rather than sort of purely strategic one, where you're just thinking about managing potentially self-interested actors, right? Let's try and think a bit about what we together would like to see in society. Right, and just to give a sense of what I mean by this, consider the ideal norms governing social technical systems they actually are going to just differ depending on whether they serve public interest, corporations, or private users, right? Smart energy grids might need to be efficient, but also equitable to all citizens. Automated authorities might need to provide explainable decisions in order to be legitimate and ensure the right to contestation. Algorithmic hiring should be non-discriminatory, and perhaps there should be limits on wealth accumulation by, say, digital asset management algorithms. Personal virtual assistants, which is what we're seeing a lot nowadays with these chatbots, should protect user privacy, perhaps, or avoid copyright violation, and perhaps refuse to enable aggression by the user upon others, right? So now these norms and the reasons behind them might sound well and good. I just listed all these sound maybe pretty intuitive to all of us. But in a rapidly evolving AI ecosystem, you might be wondering how we could hope to do that kind of careful design at scale, right? Over the past few years, for example, we've seen multiple releases of surprisingly powerful text and image generation models, and that's unlikely to stop. So how can governance keep up, right? And as it turns out, many people have been thinking about exactly this problem. And rules for flat roles, for example, Gillian Hadfield proposes regulatory markets as a way to rapidly innovate new laws for new technologies, breaking what she calls a monopoly power currently held by the existing legal profession. And in a recent op-ed, Divya Siddharth makes the case for collective intelligence, coordinating systems that incorporate and process decentralized decision-making across individuals and communities, right? Enabling not just collective design of norms, but what might be called democratic, scalable oversight over AI systems. And in fact, some of these ideas were recently applied in an experiment run by Anthropic in collaboration with the Collective Intelligence Project, which was founded by Divya Siddharth and Safran Huang. In this experiment called Collective Constitutional AI, they actually collected public input on what principles a large language model chatbot, so a particular kind of AI system, should be aligned with, finding areas of agreement and disagreement by using an algorithm called Polis, right? And these consensus principles were then used as a constitution to fine-tune the language model, producing assistive behavior that was better aligned with these publicly sourced norms, right? So that's one side of the equation, which is about how we can collectively design and agree upon norms for AI systems. But once we've decided upon them, how do we actually enforce them? Well, this really isn't the focus of my talk at all, but I just do want to briefly point out there's so much activity on this nowadays, right? With the adoption of the EU AI Act going on in March, the establishment of several AI safety institutes, and introduction of bills aiming to regulate large pre-trained models. And of course, along with this, there's a lot of debate about how best to go forward, especially around the trade-offs between safety and, say, technological progress. But at least at this point in time, it seems to me like we're somewhat on track to actually creating enforcement mechanisms so that AI developers and users will actually comply with norms that we sort of collectively decide upon. Right. I think perhaps what is less discussed now, and I would like to see more work on, is ensuring that the rules and norms we create and enforce are actually going to be legitimate and actually reflect, as far as possible, and democratic societies and hopefully beyond them as well, are legitimate and sort of reflect the popular will. Given that AI systems right now are largely developed and controlled by large companies, sometimes by governments, how can we actually make them accountable to the public and at large? And so I'm going to make a brief pitch for considering more the question of not just goodness, but also legitimacy, not just fairness, but also legitimacy in sort of designing and creating the sort of social technical infrastructure for a sort of beneficial AI future. I think we don't just want progress and safety, but also participation and accountability to all the people that we live together with. Great. All right, so that was governance. Let's say we now have all these rules and norms. And now the question that I focus more on as a technical researcher is how do we actually get AI systems to reliably comply with them, especially if the norms are ambiguous or incomplete, right? In answering this question, I'm really building upon the insight made by Dylan Hatfield-Manel and Gillian Hatfield, which is that AI alignment can be viewed as analogous to the problem of incomplete contracting in economics. In other words, AI alignment is a principal-agent problem where task specifications for AI systems can be viewed as incomplete contracts between the principal, the human, and the agent. But typically this has been framed in just in this one human, one AI setting, but you think about in general, who is the principal in this case? I want to say that this is not just one person, but us, the sort of multiple overlapping communities in which AI systems are embedded. And so the norms and specifications for AI systems aren't just incomplete contracts, they're incomplete social contracts, right? Which AI systems need to navigate, right? And the tradition of the idea of a social contract has typically been applied to notion at the national level, but I think it really can be extended to like sort of multiple sort of communal levels as well. Right, and as the Hadfields point out, building AI systems that can navigate this sort of normative structure is a distinct research program from learning human preferences. They make this really underappreciated point, which is that I think many human preferences are actually secondary, not primary. Sort of they're outcomes of a process of evaluating likely community responses and acting on that basis, not a primitive of choice, and sort of the language they use in that paper. So how are we going to carry out this agenda? Well, I think the solution space is going to differ depending on whether we're building low autonomy systems versus high autonomy systems, right? I think for low autonomy AI systems, I think most of the AI systems we actually have today are mostly in this category. We basically can sort of do what we're already doing, iterative development and testing to comply with relevant specifications and regulations, eliciting more specifications, editing them to sort of better figure out specify how we actually want. I think this relates to the broader project of like safety, right? Safety is one of these specifications you want in many parts of these systems. But what about high autonomy systems, including future advanced AI, right? I think, and even sort of some of the AI today, which are sort of interacting in, say, like sort of like complicated social contexts, right? I think, and these will inevitably have to act under normative uncertainty and adjudicate normative ambiguity through interactions with humans. I think a very sort of vanilla version of this, like I do have this example, I guess, in the next slide, is like how to do moderation on an AI sort of like a platform like Twitter or a social media, right? And rather than learning user preferences, these systems will have to learn and understand the sort of normative infrastructure that generates their intended functions, roles, and norms. And just to show we already face a version of this problem, consider toxic text generation, right? And sort of like already kind of old update to their GPT-3 language model back in, was this 2022, I think, or 2021? I'm not sure now, time has flown. OpenAI showed a new alignment technique, it's not new anymore, called reinforcement learning from human feedback that reduced the toxic outputs of their model according to a certain benchmark. But what does toxic mean here, right? Toxic to whom? In what context? For what reasons? What if I want a GPT-3 to be toxic to help script a toxic movie character, right? And you would hope that alignment techniques actually try and address all of this normative complexity. But if you look at what OpenAI did and what people tend to be doing now, they just trained this sort of second reward model to mimic human rankings of whether outputs are better or worse, potentially like conflating all the ways in which text can be potentially better or worse, right? And they just use this reward model to fine-tune the language model. And this improved results. I mean, this has given like tremendous gains in how the usability of these systems, but I think it actually sort of ignores a lot of the deep complexity in human normative judgments. And I think it's to me still very much an open question whether these things actually understand what toxic means, for example, versus like managing to mimic it or approximate it quite well on the data distribution it's trained on, right? So how can we do better, right? I think first we need models of human behavior that separate out the influences of what I think of as mere preferences, right? You might think of these as like consumer preferences or individual desires from norms. And I've explored this in some of my previous work, allowing us to separately infer individual desires and shared normative structures from a population of agents. And in a related line of work, Julian Harrow-Ettinger has proposed that we need to take what's called an institutional stance towards human behavior, rather than modeling humans as guided by only their beliefs and desires, which is like the sort of traditional approach to theory of mind. We need to understand how they might play different roles in a society. And based on how they interact with each other, we can hopefully infer those roles in sort of the broader institutional normative structures they're embedded in. And just a sort of elaboration of like how you could go about this research, I recently actually presented this paper with my wonderful co-author Ninel Oldenburg on learning and sustaining social norms in norm augmented Markov games. What we actually did here is we sort of proposed a new formalism for the question: how do we like model and study agents that are learning social norms by observing other agents' behavior? So we set this in the context of sequential decision-making and reinforcement learning, sort of a game theoretic context where there's an uncertain set of norms that each agent initially is unaware of. And by observing what other agents are doing, they are actually able to infer, okay, you know, if everyone is cleaning the river every once in a while, because otherwise it gets polluted, maybe I should do that too, because that's some kind of community norm, right? And so sort of this is, I think, quite nicely illustrated, where by this sort of animation we have here, where there's actually this learning agent here in red, who initially doesn't know what the norms that society follows are, and then there's these experienced agents who already do know the norms. The norms here include like clean the river regularly, so that it doesn't get too polluted. If it gets too polluted, the apples will start dying out. Don't eat too many apples, because otherwise the apples won't regrow as quickly. So in a single area, you don't want to consume all of them. And you can sort of see that the learning agent initially doesn't really know what's going on. It's not clearly cleaning the river, but towards the end, it starts learning. It's like, oh, I should do this, right? I should sort of like start also cleaning the river. Sort of some applications of this idea, like more immediately, are, say, self-driving cars. You put them in a new cultural environment. Maybe they're sort of trained in the US, but now they're sort of moved to India or moved to Japan, where the road norms are very different. And they now need to figure out, okay, like when should I pause, when should I stop? You know, should I let pedestrians go first, etc. And I think more generally, once you have, I think, these sort of more social interactive systems, like chatbots are in some ways part of this context, right? How can they adapt to sort of local conversational norms quite quickly? Cool. So I think all that sort of research is a step in the right direction. Very happy to talk more about the sort of technical details of that if people are interested during the questions. But I think we need to go further than just learning existing norms still, right? Because if you merely infer existing roles and norms, well, many existing norms are just bad norms, right? And we might want to change them, right? I've talked about how we might go beyond, I think, mere compliance with the sort of letter of the law, because sometimes people say things that isn't fully what they mean. Towards willful compliance with the sort of spirit of the law, right? Which includes inferring the unspoken bits, right? But I think really what we want something for really sort of increasingly autonomous systems is an enlightened compliance, right? Complying with the principles behind the law, which may mean making revisions to the law or sort of like choosing to sort of adapt it or break it where really necessary, right? And how do we do that? I think let's recall the design framework for roles, laws, and norms I outlined earlier, right? For AI systems to comply with norms in enlightened, flexible ways, I think they'll need to reverse engineer the processes of social deliberation that generate answers to these questions, right? Understanding not just what norms are, but the function, the social function they serve. Oops, I think, yeah, that came out later. And how can we go about doing that? I briefly mentioned some work on moral reasoning earlier. I think that sort of provides a way of thinking about how we come up with norms and laws in the first place, right? You can think of laws and norms as solutions to sort of social coordination problems, given the fact that we're all agents with different interests and we want to, you know, either come upon some mutually agreeable agreement minimally, or just like respect each other's interests, right? And so, you know, strategies for normative reasoning, like universalization principles or argumentation logics, I think provide a step towards building systems that can reason in this way. And I think we can build systems that don't just go off and do this by themselves, but that engage in normative reasoning in conjunction with the human communities they serve, and thereby not just comply with law, but help us extrapolate or change it to deal with new situations. In describing these directions, I want to be quite clear that I don't mean that AI systems should go off and philosophize on their own to implement the perfect moral theory without any human consent. I think that could be quite dangerous. But I think to design them in such a way that they will have a sort of interactive, collaborative process with human societies so that we continue to have autonomy over our civilizational future, augmented with these sort of like normative reasoning aids. Cool. So I think that really actually brings me to the end of this overall framework of contractual AI alignment. In describing this vision for societally aligned AI systems, I've aimed to avoid the practical and political challenges facing dominant approaches to AI alignment, and to also provide a conceptual bridge between AI governance and technical research, right? In doing so, I hope I've shown you all a different approach towards engaging with the individual, different approach towards ensuring individual, communal, and universal flourishing in a diverse and plural technological future. And for that, I would like to thank a lot of the sort of like communities and people who eventually sort of led to this sort of version of talk you're seeing today. I first presented this at Effective Altruism Global X back in 2022. This work was sort of like initiated partly through my conversations with the principles of intelligent behavior and biological social systems. And I want to thank the labs I've been part of, the MIT Computational Cognitive Science Group, the Probabilistic Computing Project, and also as a visitor to the Algorithmic Alignment Lab sometimes as sort of a really nice community sort of for fleshing out these ideas and giving me, I think, the conceptual tools to even start thinking about AI alignment in this way. With that, I'm very happy to take any questions.
And thank you so much for such an insightful presentation. And I'm pretty sure many participants have questions for you. I'd like to ask if there's anybody who has a question, please raise a hand through the reaction button. And I know I have one question in the chat. So one question we've got from Yamakawa-san is that how AI should maintain and enhance human capabilities? Is there a risk that human abilities could be lost if AI excessively supports human activities? So if Yamakawa-sensei could elaborate on that through audio, please do if you could speak, but otherwise, I think you can see the question in the chat too.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm happy to, that's a great question. Yeah, it's not something I was really hoping to tackle this talk, but I think it's an important one to think about. I mean, I do think it's a case that, with just any kind of automation, not just what gets called AI nowadays, people already have lost some capabilities, right? And I think the nice thing is that oftentimes that's been traded off, like, even though I don't really know how to do things like sew clothes nowadays, even though most people used to be able to do that in their own homes, right? Apart from simple repairs, now, I'm freed up to do other things, right? And so I think it's not always bad to lose certain skills if the sort of like in general we end up being more empowered and free to do future things, other things. Now, I think with AI there is a sort of increasing worry that perhaps if one of the things that makes us sort of like uniquely human is our ability to sort of reason and sort of like decide for ourselves what we want to do with our lives, right? To sort of live what you might call a rational life. And I think that in particular is something that, I don't think it's actually even conceptually possible to automate away because like, you're basically giving up authority over your own life if you're telling an AI system to solve that problem for you, or like a community is basically giving up its own authority to decide like how they want to live if they sort of like delegate everything to AI system. I think there is a risk of pressures, economic pressures, towards increasingly delegating those important questions about how do I want to live my own life, or how do we want to live our lives together to some AI system, and like in the belief that somehow it's more objective and correct and gives the right answers. But I think we always need to remember, actually, I think, unless you're really a hardcore utilitarian who thinks that there's only one way to live a good life, which is to maximize everyone's welfare. These are just, there's no one single answer. You have to decide it for yourself. And in that sense, it really makes no sense to fully delegate it. You have to answer the question for yourself. And I think that's something we should guard against.
Thank you. And thank you, Yamakawa-sensei, for such an insightful question. I'm pretty sure this is something that everybody here is starting to think about, and it's becoming more and more relevant every day. I've got a hand up from Mariyama-san, please.
Yeah, thank you, Xuan, for coming today. I am Mariyama at Align. I'm doing mostly doing the administration work in Align, and I'm very honored to have you on our second webinar series. And I have many questions, but I will pick one or two. And so I was reading your blog post on this topic with Mari the other day, and yeah, it was very interesting, but also very difficult also. And I want clarification. I want is what you mean by like contractualist framing. So my question is, what is the entity of a contract when we think about human AI contract? Because if you like assume you are contracting to a robot that is in front of you, the robot is like connected to the internet, and there's a big AI behind it, and like that robot may be deceiving you, and so it's hard to see the boundary of the entity of the contract. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I personally hope that we don't necessarily have to deal with the super big AI models, especially for things like robotics for like privacy reasons. But yeah, I think it's sort of like, you know, who are the contracting parties here, right? I think it's an important question. And I think one thing I've been trying to do with this talk is like expand the notion of the contracting party, not just to like, you know, I think traditionally it's either two people, like, you know, the principal and the agent, or all of us in the state, right? Those are the two sort of polar opposites of like how people have thought about sort of economic contracts versus social contracts. I think like one way we want to expand is like we can think of sort of smaller scale communities like an institution as potentially a contracting party, or we're all contracting with each other when we enter one particular institution. Now, like how do AI systems like, you know, enter that role? I'm sort of disinclined to think of the AI systems as necessarily like persons who are party to the contract themselves, but really the developers or people, owners of the systems, or are sort of going to be like have to design their systems in accordance with rules and norms that we agree with. So I think the most basic thing right now is like, well, you know, every time you use, you know, one of these OpenAI models, you are agreeing to certain kinds of terms and conditions for using those models in a way that is, of course, really strongly controlled by OpenAI right now, but in return for some benefits, right? And I think that's how to think about, that's I think how I tend to think about sort of who's the entity involved in the contract. It's not so much the AI system. I think if we have increasingly autonomous systems, then we might need to start thinking about those directions. So for example, I think it's plausible that, you know, I'm thinking of settings where this seems most likely to me, like maybe self-driving cars or like autonomous trading agents.
When can you hear me?
シュアンスさんだけが固まってる感じですかね。
多分そうですかね。
ちょっとビデオを切ります。
多分もう一度入ってくださっていると思われるので、少々お待ちください。本日12時までの予定だったんですけれども、もしまだご質問がある方で、ちょっと時間内に収まりそうにないなというふうに思われる方、できればそのチャットに書いていただけますと、この後、陳さんに個別に伺うということもできそうですので、残れる方はぜひ直接伺っていただければ。Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, sorry for that. I'm not sure why I sound disconnected.
No worries, no worries. I think the last word I heard was autonomous system. I think that's where you.
Yeah. So I was just trying to think. I think with increasing autonomous systems, it's possible that they will start to be able to be contracting parties in themselves. But then, you know, for example, I think one thing that could happen is that, you know, already in smart contract stuff like this is sort of happening where sort of autonomous agents, say like a self-driving car, sort of an automated negotiating agent may sort of propose agreements with another party and sort of like in that context to satisfy them. Now, then I think in those situations, we need to really think about what's the meta contract that governs how these systems are proposing and negotiating contracts. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so Hamada-san, I think you had a question.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks, Sean. It's a very excellent talk. I'm very excited. I'm a neuroscientist, but I also do somehow supporting this plurality movement in Japan. And yeah, so that's the reason why I'm really excited about your talk. Actually, the question is kind of different from that kind of perspective, but so you mentioned that the alignment as kind of approximations of utility function from the multiple agent. I'm curious that is there like an explicit direct investigation relationship between like the different agent has a different utility function and how we can somehow extract that utility function with a small number of the agent, because if those utility function is quite different, then very simple approach is just imitate all the agents one by one. But if you extract some utility function with a small number of agent, or yeah, so there's always a gap between those utility functions. And I'm curious that is there any direct study looking at those kind of gap, and single agent is might be worse than like a multi agents.
Yeah, so I think the sort of most, I mean, there's a bunch of work in this setting. I think the sort of the most formal study I've seen in sort of the context of AI alignment literature. I think, in game theory economics, versions of this problem have been studied, right? Like you have multiple stakeholders, and so there's this idea of multi-principal assistance games, and like one sort of question that comes up in that setting is, I'm just going to try and define the paper and send it. It's by I think Stuart Russell and some others. And sort of basic idea there is like, well, once you have multiple principals, actually have incentives to strategically, and you're trying to assist multiple of them, they're going to have incentives to strategically sort of communicate their interest in one way, and they may be deceiving actually the sort of provider benefit in that setting. So I think that's sort of one setting in which I think I've seen it studied. Now I do think one thing I want to say is like, part of why I sort of started out that framing of alignment is because I actually think that we maybe want to move away from thinking of agents having utility functions in the first place, or be a bit more careful about what those utility functions mean. They're just like one way of representing or approximating how they're sort of all things considered preferences of people, of individuals. And I think one reason why we may want to move away from the utility function approach is that sometimes I think we don't need to like learn the utility function of every single agent in the system to produce good behavior. I think it's just sort of, we're trying to solve a harder problem that actually needs to be solved. And the other thing I think is that I think just the level of thinking of things as a utility function, I mean, among other things, it assumes that agents have complete preferences, which I don't think that's always true, but also it just sort of like really misses some of the like underlying, utility functions are defined over some space. Typically that in economics that has been like consumer goods, but really that's over outcomes, and outcomes need to be described in some language. And the language of describing those outcomes is really where all the, I think, hard stuff is happening, because that's when we talk about things like what does it mean to be helpful, what does it mean to be harmful, what does it mean to be toxic, right? The semantics, the meaning of those words is really, I think, where there's a lot of missing work right now. Before we start even talking about how people aggregate and trade off between those different aspects of things we care about. I know that was not answering your question, but I wanted to point that out.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'll look into it, and maybe another question actually popped up in my head. Is that you mentioned that like maybe in each individual level, maybe we don't have actual utility function, and I'm also curious that Hannah Arendt also mentioned that I think in the origin of totalitarianism could be like because we don't have such utility function in each individual level, maybe top-down level, somebody wants to actually control the collective governance. That could be the potential danger for collective intelligence. So I'm curious that maybe at some point we can find out that kind of danger as well in terms of the collective governance system. Yeah, but thanks so much. I really love your talk.
Thank you for your insightful question and also the answer. I'm aware it's already 12 o'clock, so for anyone who has their schedule afterwards, feel free to leave at this point. I know that there are still many questions that we want to ask Xuan. I personally do have one, but at this point, I'd like to close for once, and then perhaps if I can ask later on to Xuan a little bit more about the question I have. So I'd like to move on to the introduce the next episode of the series that we still have. Align has kindly organized a webinar series. So I'd like to share my screen for a moment. Yeah, so thank you again for everybody for taking part in today's lecture. And thank you, Xuan, for joining us from Singapore. We really appreciate that for your talk and for preparing an updated version of your talk since the last, we had your talk last 2 years ago. Yeah, so next time we have our talk, we are still having our talk third episode of the webinar series on the 24th of May, organized by Align. So please, for those of you interested, please join. And thank you for your extremely valuable thoughts and your opinions on view on the past developments in the pluralism in AI alignment, as well as the future of it. I'm pretty sure this past hour has been very valuable, really an opportunity to really rethink about what we could do, what we can further think about governance in the research field of AI alignment. So thank you again, Xuan, and everybody who helped on us organizing this webinar. So thank you. Okay, so for those of you who have schedules afterwards, please leave. But otherwise, Xuan, are you okay with a little bit more questions?
Yes, I'm happy to stay on for a bit longer. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
10-15 minutes even. I have time. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so one question I was personally curious to know is, at the core of your article and all the talk you have given so far, I think the notion of inclusiveness is really emphasized, and the principle of diversity and connecting all these people's values. And I'm pretty sure this has been a pretty good, big discussion in political science, sociology, even like science, technology, and society studies. But I was wondering how you think about drawing a line of who can and who cannot participate in these decision making, because the worry is that there are certain people who are for extremism, or who are racist, who are sexist, and there are always these risks. So how do you think about these inclusion and potential risks of inclusion?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, right? It's like, and I think goes to the heart of like the traditional questions, like what it means to, build a democratic society or like a free and equal society, despite the fact that some people don't want to live in a free and equal society, and we still need to. I don't know to have an answer, to that question. Like, but I do think we sort of need to be really cognizant of that as we sort of build AI systems. And I think I'll sort of take at this, like try and answer this from two perspectives. I think that's what's like what morally is desirable, right? Given a certain kind of egalitarian perspective, what I think we should try to aim for. And then I think what's strategically achievable, sort of separate. And I think we will end up somewhere in between those two, I think, in practice. And so I think morally, I think contractualism, I think, gives us a really nice way as a framework of thinking about how this idea of like reasonable rejection, right? That comes out in Scanlon's work, right? The reasonable is doing a lot of work. It's like a pretty important role, right? You can't just like be unreasonable in the way you sort of say that, like, oh, like one thing someone would say is like, oh, it's really unreasonable for me to have to wear a mask at all, right? It's actually a common view among many parts of the population. I think it's worth unpacking, right? I think being able to sort of like persuade each other and like what counts as reasonable, unreasonable in those settings, right? Or it's unreasonable for the government to limit my speech about being able to call people swear words or something like that, right? I think from a first principles perspective, I think there are good reasons to think that maybe those kinds of objections actually aren't reasonable after all, and everyone has to ultimately make their own judgment call about that. But it's sort of one way, sort of from the moral philosophy perspective, to think about in what cases sort of people's voices don't end up counting, right? As much as some of their objections will count, and some of their proposals will count, and sometimes they won't, because they're sort of like not engaging in a process of treating each other as rational agents and like accepting each other's reasons. I think from a strategic perspective, right, I think we just unfortunately do live in a world where people have like vastly different notions of what's reasonable and what's good. And I think what we can do then is we try and build institutions which are robust and resilient and sort of like lead to outcomes which are, you know, even if they're not optimal for any one party, are sort of like everyone can agree upon because they're sort of beneficial from everyone's lives to some degree. And I think that's sort of how we've made, you know, to the extent that decision-making has been democratic, which I think in many cases is not, but I think that's to sort of some degree how we've sort of made progress, right? I think people are willing to, you know, even though some people are really, it's really important to them to be able to like have certain kinds of values or beliefs, even discriminatory ones, I think they've been willing to accept that, you know, they have to sort of give up some of the ability to express those things or give up some of the, you know, the actually implement them separate of expressing them in order to live together with others, right? And sort of like, that's why we don't, in at least some places, live in completely authoritarian or fascist settings. So I think that's how separating those two is important. Yeah.
Thank you. And from the first time I read your article, I felt like really strongly how deeply connected this problem of this challenge of AI pluralism is. Pluralism's connection with the whole concept of liberal democracy or any of the political challenges that we've historically faced. And I thought it was such a valuable article, and I think you are such a valuable figure in this AI alignment research who really tries to connect that bridge, that gap that was previously not so focused on by many researchers. So yeah, thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Is there any other last minute question?
If I can have 2 or 3 minutes, so I was very interested in your portfolio of your interests. So you have very wide expertise, in my opinion, because you are an expert in probabilistic programming, and in my image is that the probabilistic programming is a very promising route to like more capable AI, in a sense that maybe that may complement.
More reliable, hopefully safer as well. That is my hope.
Oh, right? Okay. So
I think definitely both more capable. I think my hope is that capable in a reliable way that we can sort of make stronger guarantees about is sort of what I would say there.
Okay, so that's how you link your expertise in that field and you're interested in AI safety. So it's very connected. Okay.
Right.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
I think for me, so I think, you know, it's sort of come from this interesting tradition, you know, in my PhD, which is like unites sort of the ideas from cognitive science, computational cognitive science, and Bayesian cognitive science in particular with probabilistic programming. And so I think what is the connection with all these interests? You know, I think I just had my interest because you know, I'm a bit of a philosophy nerd. You can probably tell from the talk. I just always liked that, and like part of how I ended up doing a PhD or like was drawn into AI alignment. I didn't necessarily think it was the most important problem. It was just like this is a really interesting problem to think about, right? And it really felt to me that people weren't thinking about it the right way, and there's so much more philosophy to draw on to like have the right, say, mathematical formalisms to actually express these sort of like fuzzier moral ideas in a sort of in the context of the machine system. And that's sort of why I've ended up having this convergence of interest. And I think that sort of dovetails quite nicely with the sort of approach of computational cognitive science as a field is like precisely that, like, you know, all these sort of like amazing things that human cognition does, we've mostly managed to describe at a qualitative level through psychology, but how can we actually begin to sort of like write down formal computational theories for what people are doing? One way of doing that is to draw upon the tradition of Bayesian reasoning in order to formalize that, and that's where the probabilistic programming comes into picture, right? And so the hope is that probabilistic programming becomes a way for us to sort of, you know, write models of both the world and of humans that reflect our intuitive human understanding of each other, right? And so that, you know, systems will be more interpretable, we can interact with them better. And if we're talking about models of the world, we can sort of verify properties of those models of the world in ways that we understand better. I think that for me is, I think, the connection. And of course, one of the areas that cognitive scientists study is precisely social reasoning and moral reasoning. And that's sort of the area I work in. That's why I'm interested in building models of humans and their values and building models that are interpretable so we can check that those models actually make sense in accordance with our intuitive theories. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree that we should understand humans more if we want to have aligned AI. So I think that's a very promising route to pursue. Thank you very much.
Okay, with that, I think we're closing today's webinar. Thanks so much, Xuan, for coming. And I hope to keep in touch going forward with and we will. I think this opportunity is really a point that we start thinking more about pluralism and AI alignment here in Japan and wider part of Asia. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. Really a pleasure to meet all of you.
So we will,
Yeah, see you.